Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Redwood Library in Newport, Rhode Island. I am Joe Rusnak, Assistant Director of Programs, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our second of our virtual lectures, generously sponsored by the Jarzombach Family Foundation, Marianne, Mark, and Michelle Drum. As this is a new platform for us, as well as you, if during the lecture you experience any sound problems or video problems, please click the audio help. There are two locations for that, located at the bottom left hand of the screen or at the top right hand corner of the title bar where the help button is. And also for larger viewing pleasure, during any point in time, if you would like a full view of the screen, on the extreme right of the title bar, you'll see a little shadow of a box, and that will toggle into full screen. Tonight's speaker is Dr. Richard Bell. Dr. Bell holds a bachelor's degree from University of Cambridge and a PhD from Harvard University. And Dr. Bell is the associate professor of history at the University of Maryland. He has won more than a dozen teaching awards, including the 2017 University System of Maryland Board of Regents Faculty Award for Excellence in Teaching, which is the highest honor for teaching faculty in the Maryland state system. He has held major research fellowships at Yale, Cambridge, and the Library of Congress, and is the recipient of the National Endowment of Humanities Public Scholar Award. Oh, and he is also the author of the book we will be speaking about tonight, Stolen. Ladies and gentlemen, we give you Professor Richard Bell.
Thanks very much. I hope everyone can hear me and see me okay. It is a weird pleasure to be with you on these terms in this way. I was really hoping that we'd be able to do this live, and I'd be able to come up to Newport and visit the library and see the building and the collections myself. I love doing live events and meeting new people face to face. So this is a good second best. I'm really grateful for this opportunity that Joe and Carolyn and everyone else at the Redwood have provided to talk about this book, which you can see over my shoulder. Is not so subtle product placement, because it is about important topics which during our current crisis over the last few days seem perhaps ever more urgent. So I'm really grateful for this platform to speak about the people and the issues featured in the book. And some of you may be able to draw some conclusions for the present from some of the things I have to say tonight. I guess we'll see. So I'm going to speak for about 35 minutes, and then we're going to try and see if there are any questions, and we can have a short discussion. Never as fun as doing these things live, of course, but hopefully this platform will allow more people to at least participate, regardless of their geography. So thank you very much, everyone. I'm going to get started, and I've got a few slides to show along the way. Cornelius Sinclair was 10 years old, and he was trapped. He was stuck. He was locked in the belly of a small ship that might have looked a bit like this one, that was bobbing in the middle of the Delaware River, a mile south of Philadelphia. A man had grabbed this 10-year-old child, Cornelius, from the city's market an hour ago, had shoved a black gag into this child's mouth, tossed him into a wagon, and hauled him here. And it was dark below the waterline of this little ship, but Cornelius could see enough to know that he was not alone down there. 4 other pairs of eyes stared back at him, 4 other black boys. One looked about his size. He was maybe 10 or 9 years old, like Cornelius. 2 more were taller, perhaps 14 or 15 years old. The last of them was shorter and smaller than the rest. He might have been as young as 8 years old. Yesterday, all 5 boys had been free, like you and me. Now, suddenly, they were slaves, prisoners of a gang of child snatchers who planned to sell their lives and their labors, most likely to plantation owners down in the deep, deep South. If their abductors got away with this, 10-year-old Cornelius would spend the rest of his life as someone else's property, somewhere very far away. He would probably never see his family, his friends again. Cornelius disappeared in late August of 1825, one of dozens of African-American children to vanish in similar circumstances from Philadelphia that single year alone. In the early 19th century, Philadelphia was the hub of American slavery's blackest market. The city's gridded streets, its tangled alleys, were hunting grounds for crews of professional kidnappers who made their livings turning free black kids like 10-year-old Cornelius into Southern slaves. They did their work swiftly and shamelessly, in brazen affront to Philadelphia's reputation at the time as the city of brotherly love, as a safe haven for people of color, and as the headquarters of America's anti-slavery movement at this time. But to kidnappers, none of that stuff mattered one jot. And in truth, early 19th century Philadelphia was probably one of the most dangerous places to be free and black anywhere in the United States. And this was a product of its location as the nearest free city to the slave South at the time. Philadelphia was just about, 40 miles north of the Mason-Dixon line, the boundary that separated Pennsylvania from several slave states immediately to the south. And as Pennsylvania and several other northern states had slowly disentangled themselves from race slavery in the 50 or so years after the American Revolution, that boundary running along Pennsylvania's southern border had become ever more important, especially for black people. By 1825, the year that Cornelius was kidnapped, that Mason-Dixon line seemed to divide two worlds, separating northern free states from the southern slave states. For African Americans, it was the closest and most meaningful thing to a modern international border anywhere in North America. Philadelphia's proximity to that frontier line just to the south of the city made Philadelphia's many free black residents attractive targets for professional people snatchers. They would prey on the members of this city's black community relentlessly, putting bullseyes on their backs, putting prices on their heads. And the people they stole away from freedom could fetch anywhere up to $15,000 per person in today's money in Louisiana, in Mississippi, in Alabama, three of the new territories and states that were rising up along the Gulf Coast at exactly this time. And the American I'll get to this slide in a minute, but my slides just took off. I'll catch up. The American settlers swarming into that new southwestern region, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, they demanded and needed, they said, a nearly bottomless supply of forced labor to cut sugarcane, to pick cotton. And they would take almost anyone to do that work they didn't want to do themselves, including, it seems, free children as young as 10-year-old Cornelius. Now, buying some of their laborers from kidnappers was probably not these planters' first choice, but by 1825, the year that Cornelius went missing, slaveholders in the Deep South had limited options. Planters down there in the Deep South had been forced to look to domestic sources for their manpower needs ever since the year 1808. Now, 1808 is not a very famous year or well-known year in American history. It's not nearly as famous as 1766, or let me start that again, 1776, or 1865, or 1968. But something really important in the history of slavery happened in 1808, because in that year, a new law went into effect, passed by lawmakers in Congress, that outlawed any further imports of African people from the continent of Africa or from the Caribbean for the purposes of enslaving them in the United States. That 1808 law, that 1808 decision was a major turning point in the history of slavery in America, a turning point that would spur the growth of something you see on the screen, an internal slave trade or a domestic slave trade within the United States. After that 1808 decision, interstate slave traders here in the United States would try to satisfy these Southwestern settlers' demands for black labor by bringing them thousands of American-born enslaved people each year from existing slave states like Maryland, where I'm speaking to you from tonight, and Virginia. So that's the legal domestic slave trade, and it was big business. But settlers down in the Deep South wanted even more. And the more they were willing to pay, the more tempting and profitable it became for anyone sufficiently cold-blooded to try to kidnap free people like Cornelius from northern cities like Philadelphia, smuggle them into this legal domestic slave trade, this legal supply chain, and then sell them as if they were legally purchased enslaved people in this vast new southwestern slave market. These economic incentives left Philadelphia's large and vibrant free black community dangerously exposed to kidnappers coming in from just across state lines. By 1825, the city of brotherly love had become the center of an inter-regional kidnapping operation. It had become the northern terminus of what I talk about in my book as the reverse Underground Railroad. So this reverse Underground Railroad and its much better known namesake, the Underground Railroad, they of course ran in opposite directions, right? And of course existed for fundamentally different reasons. But in many ways, they are actually mirror images of one another. So let's talk about that comparison just for a minute or two. On the Underground Railroad, that's the good one, the famous one, the Harriet Tubman one, enslaved people would abandon southern plantations and trek northward, dreaming of new lives and new opportunities in freedom. On what I'm calling this evening the reverse Underground Railroad, free black people would vanish from northern towns and cities like Philadelphia and be made to trudge southward to be sold into plantation slavery. On the Underground Railroad, conductors and station agents like Harriet Tubman would risk their lives and their own liberty to help black fugitives make these epic journeys of freedom. On what I'm calling the reverse Underground Railroad, its conductors were kidnappers and human traffickers motivated by money. Both of these two networks, one obviously good and heroic, one obviously bad and I would say evil, roared to life in the early 19th century to exploit what by then had become major differences in the legal status of slavery in the northern states and in the southern states. Both of these networks, the good one and the evil one, ran on secrecy and relied on small circles of trusted participants, on forged documents, on false identities, on disguise. Whether traveling from the slave states into the free states or being stolen from the free states and being made to travel into the slave states, black voyagers on both these metaphorical railroads often had to hide in stables, barns, and attics. The direction of travel was different, of course, but the routes taken by freedom seekers and by victims of kidnapping being sold into slavery like Cornelius Sinclair, the routes on a map were often the same. They might even have passed one another on the roads from time to time. And what's more, folks, the volume of traffic, the number of black people on both these railroads was, believe it or not, roughly the same. Each one carried hundreds of black adults and children across state lines each year. Most Americans, I hope, know a good deal about the Underground Railroad, the good one, the famous one. Historians have spent more than 150 years by now, I think, studying the tactics and the strategies that Harriet Tubman and her fellow conductors and station agents used to help freedom seekers escape from slavery. the achievements and heroism of folks like Tubman are finally starting to command center stage in American popular culture. There are walking tours, there are television shows about the Underground Railroad. There's a great museum in Cincinnati, you can see here on the slide. And there's also this new movie that came out, about 6 months ago now, before COVID, when life seemed normal. Harriet, it's called. It's the first time Harriet Tubman's got the big screen Hollywood treatment. And I should say for the record that I do not think this movie is a perfect movie, but I'm really glad it exists and that we get to talk about it. Because it shines a spotlight on a group of individuals who ran the Underground Railroad who deserve that spotlight because of genuine heroism. I'm an historian. I work for a living studying people before the Civil War. And the more I learn about some of the people I study in the period before the Civil War, the less I admire them, the less I like them, the more I want to take them down off a pedestal. So I find it hard to find heroes in American history sometimes. But if you're looking for heroes in American history, you should always start with the Underground Railroad, because it is full of American heroes, led by the woman on the screen, Harriet Tubman. So we know quite a lot about the Underground Railroad. We know far less, I think, about what I'm calling this evening the reverse Underground Railroad. Its conductors, its station agents worked tirelessly to remain untouchable. And the identities of all but a handful of these criminals, these outlaws, these monsters still remain a secret decades later. Harriet Tubman on the Underground Railroad would sometimes give lecture tours and go on fundraising missions to publicize her work. But of course, the criminals who built the reverse Underground Railroad never did that sort of thing. Only rarely do their names or their crimes appear in surviving police files or trial transcripts. That low profile in surviving legal sources, the result of the decades they spent in the shadows, protected by bribes, by corruption, and by massive amounts of indifference among people who lived at the time to what they were doing. Unlike legal interstate slave traders who sometimes bequeathed their papers to Southern colleges and historical societies, the criminal outlaws who built this reverse Underground Railroad, they left no business records, no bundles of private papers for historians like me to stumble across in the Library of Congress and read and examine. These kidnappers did not write memoirs. They did not pose for photographs or for paintings, leaving journalists and activists at the time to just guess at what they might have looked like. And you can see one guess on the screen right here. The homes they occupied, the warehouses they used, generally no longer stand. But as I argue in my new book, Stolen, these professional kidnappers nonetheless left their mark everywhere on 19th century America. If we think not just about Philadelphia, where this true story is set, but about any northern state where there's a town or a city with a significant free black population, New York, Boston, Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, etc., etc. If we think not just about 1825, when this true story is set, but about every single year in the first 60 years of the 19th century, we can say with some depressing certainty that all told, these kidnappers stole away probably tens of thousands of free black people, many of them children like Cornelius, under the age of 16 years old. Most of those they kidnapped could not read or write, and to be very clear with you, most of those they kidnapped were never heard from again. Their parents and friends, of course, would search, would advertise, would petition, they would wait in earnest for any sort of news, but usually no news came. Free black people in northern cities like Philadelphia had very few white allies at this time in American history, beyond the meager ranks of a few Quaker-led anti-slavery societies. What's more, white employers would openly discriminate against African-American job applicants. White city constables generally ignored people of color's complaints and usually turned a blind eye to most white on black street violence. So when children like Cornelius went missing, their parents and friends could hardly ever persuade mayors or magistrates to get involved, to do something to get those children back. It was rarer still for anyone to be able to gather enough evidence to issue arrest warrants, to search property, to interrogate suspects. And even then, experienced members of these many different kidnapping crews all over the country knew what to do and what to say to talk their way out of trouble and to get back to work. I'm hoping that most of you out there, and I see we've got a significant audience here, have heard of 12 Years a Slave. If we were face to face, we could do a show of hands, but I'm hoping that rings a bell. 12 Years a Slave. And if it does ring a bell, it's because 12 Years a Slave is the name of a memoir written by a guy called Solomon Northup, who was, of course, when you think about it, a forced rider, a forced passenger, a victim of this reverse underground railroad. He had that in common with, as I've said, maybe tens of thousands of other Black Americans, and that he was free and that he was kidnapped into slavery within the United States. But unlike almost anyone else to whom that happened, Solomon Northup would later escape his enslavement, though it took him 12 years to do it, and he also later wrote about that experience. And in that memoir, which is called 12 Years a Slave, written in 1853, Northup explains what riding the reverse Underground Railroad was like for him. He explains how a pair of well-dressed, white confidence men lured him from his home in upstate New York into Manhattan in 1841. And it's important that you know that when this happened to Northup, he was literate, he was prosperous, he was fully employed as a musician, and he was in his mid-30s. In Manhattan, these two well-dressed white confidence men wined him, dined him, and drugged him. And the next thing he knew, he'd been sold to an interstate slave trader in Washington, D.C., not too far from where I am today. Northup was then forced onto a slave ship that was bound for New Orleans. And in New Orleans, he was sold in one of that city's infamous slave marts to a sugar planter who put him to work cutting cane in the fields. And in 2013, an Oscar-winning film based on Northup's extraordinary autobiography drew overdue attention to Northup's ordeal. And I happen to love that film, 12 Years a Slave. I give it an A+. It's at the same time, however, it's incredibly difficult to watch, which is the point, that you shouldn't look away. But both the memoir and the movie, however wonderful they are, they offer distorted and perhaps misleading views of who the agents of this reverse Underground Railroad normally were, who they normally targeted, and how they normally made their money. Because it turns out that Solomon Northup's experience of the reverse Underground Railroad was in some ways not at all typical of everyone else's. Most kidnappings were committed not by well-dressed white confidence men, but by people from much poorer backgrounds who had never set foot in a fancy bar or restaurant, who'd never wined or dined anybody. More importantly for our purposes tonight, though, these kidnappers rarely approached highly literate, middle-aged men like Northup. They preferred instead to lure away poorly educated street kids with ruses that could swiftly separate them from their families. Very few of these captives would travel by ship to New Orleans either. Instead, kidnappers forced most boys and girls to trek southward on foot in small specialized overland convoys known as coffles, after the Arabic word for caravan. And their prisoners would rarely end up in fancy showrooms or on the auction block either. Excuse me one second. They were vastly more likely instead to be sold off along the way, in ones or twos, in furtive all-cash deals to planters in the interior of Alabama or the interior of Mississippi, to men who wanted to buy more enslaved people, but were too cheap to pay big city New Orleans slave prices. And all of that, ladies and gentlemen, all of that is almost exactly what happened to 10-year-old Cornelius Sinclair, one of the 5 central figures in this new book. In August of 1825, Cornelius and 4 other boys living in Philadelphia, whose names were Enos, Alex, Sam, and Joe, the 5 of them fell into the hands of 19th century America's most fearsome gang of kidnappers. Their captors hustled them onto a ship just outside Philly in the top right of the slide. They warehoused them for a while in a pair of safe houses down on the Delmarva Peninsula, right on the borderline between Maryland and Delaware. You can see a black dot just above the Nanticoke River where these safe houses were. And then they marched them onward, halfway across this vast continent of ours on foot, where they tried to sell these 5 free children as slaves. Look at this map. This is a monstrous distance from near where I live down to Mississippi, Alabama. It's a journey of about 1,000 miles. Remember, it was made on foot. It's a journey of about 2 million human steps. It must have been an ordeal unlike any other. In the book, I have a lot to say about this ordeal, but I'm going to hold that from these remarks. I'm also going to be a bit sort of vague and maybe a bit coy about something you may have noticed in the subtitle of my book. 5 free boys kidnapped into slavery and their astonishing Odyssey home. 4 of these boys, I won't tell you which ones, but 4 of these boys will survive this ordeal and return to their home, and home is Philadelphia. This is an extraordinary and rare outcome for cases that begin like this. And the second half of my book has a very different optimistic tone than the first half. So there's something astonishing that happens midway through this book, which triggers their ability to recover their freedom. But I'm going to be a bit vague about what it is because I want some of you to read the book, obviously. All I will say here is that what did happen next to Cornelius Sinclair and to these 4 other boys, once they met in the belly of that little ship outside Philly, was indeed astonishing. It was astonishing to them as it unfolded. It was astonishing to people at the time who knew what happened. And it was astonishing to me as I learned about their story. What would happen next to these boys and because of these boys over the next 2 years or so would involve 2 murders, one suicide, the exhumation from the ground of 3 dead bodies, a recapture, an escape, a race riot, a lawsuit, the nation's first most wanted list, and America's largest manhunt so far. Instead of spelling out exactly what happens and why, I hope you'll read the book and take a look. Let me just quickly note that the full story of what did happen next to Cornelius and these 4 other boys who went missing from Philadelphia in August of 1825 is a story that's never before been fully told. And that's for understandable reasons, because Cornelius was, I'll come to this slide in a minute, Cornelius was a child at the time he went missing. He came from a hard-up family that was not the sort of family to leave behind many traces in libraries and archives. And that's a problem, right? Because what I'm doing is not fiction. Nothing in this book is made up. Historians like me, we need sources. We need lots of sources to reconstruct past lives in ways that are true and fair. And too often, the stories and struggles of the many Americans who do not leave behind them rich troves of papers, diaries, or memoirs often remain unstudied and misunderstood as a result. So to reconstruct the basic outline of Cornelius's journey along the reverse Underground Railroad, I began by wringing what I could from a small packet of letters you can now see on the slide, written to or from Joseph Watson, who was the mayor of Philadelphia for a hot second and belatedly became involved in this case. And I turned also to the pages of a single anti-slavery newspaper that had taken an interest in the boy's disappearance. And historians have known about these two different sources, the mayor's letters and the newspaper, for a while. But on their own, they turn out to be, of course, too few and too thin and too modest to support a whole book-length reconstruction of this immensely complicated and rich story. So to supplement these sources, I had to go looking elsewhere, digging around in pretty much any archive I could think of for scraps of information, new information, I guess, that when put together could help flesh this all out. And I should confess there's been a few days in the course of researching this book where it felt like I was failing or not finding anything. When you go looking for needles in haystacks, you find a lot of hay before you find some needles. But I started to find needles the longer I kept looking, and ultimately I think it's been worth it. Over 6 years of research, I've unearthed several treasures, more than 100 new sources about this case, buried within 35 archives in 14 different states and in DC. I'm not going to list all the 100 new sources, you'll be pleased to know, but I will highlight 3 of them super quick just to give you a flavor of what I was able to find. I came across, with the help of another historian, the handwritten notes of a trial that took place down in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, a trial which would decide the fate of one of these boys, the fate of Cornelius, for the rest of his life, forever free or forever slave. A jury of Alabamians would decide. I also came across something I never thought I'd find, which is a pair of letters written by one of the kidnappers in which he lies through his teeth and pleads for his innocence. And the third source I want to mention is the source that has stuck with me unlike any other. I found it pretty early in this research process. I found it in a Philadelphia newspaper that was published about 3 days after Cornelius disappeared. And it was an item in the paper put there by his father, and it's, of course, a missing persons ad. It's short, so I can read it to you. Boy lost, it begins. My son, Cornelius Sinclair, a colored boy about 11 years old, left his friends yesterday, and as he had no cause and had never before absented himself, I fear he's been seduced away by some evil-minded person. My son is a very dark-skinned lad, pretty stout-built, thin, long fingers. His eyes are weak, his left eye is smaller than his right. Any person hearing of my son will confer a favor on his afflicted parents by giving information to my employer at the following address, Joseph Sinclair. Every time I read this short, 100, 150 word missing persons ad, I learn a lot, but the 2 words that always jump out at me like they're written 60 foot high, like they're written in neon. Afflicted parents. For parents going through this, that must have been the understatement of their lives. Before I see what questions you guys have, let me wrap up with a few quick reflections about why I think learning about America's reverse Underground Railroad is important and why Cornelius Sinclair's particular experience as a rider on it is worth your time. To begin with, I would argue forcefully that then as now, families simply belong together and Black lives matter. And so any story about free Black children ripped from their families and swallowed up by slavery is a story worth telling for its own sake. But the remarkable ordeal that Cornelius and his 4 fellow captives endured also demands our attention for many other reasons. For one thing, it serves as a pointed reminder that child snatching was heartbreakingly frequent, and that Black freedom in northern towns and cities before the Civil War was achingly fragile. It demonstrates, too, the important role that this grotesque trade in kidnapped free people played in accelerating the spread of American slavery into the Deep South over this period. Now, as I said, I'm not going to spell out everything that happens in the second half of this book or tell you exactly what happened to Cornelius after he was kidnapped and trafficked into Alabama, but I will drop a few big hints here. And I will say that the dogged efforts of all those involved in trying to save him and the 4 other boys from the horrors of slavery in the Southwest would have profound consequences. The rescue efforts of parents and allies and the aftermath of their campaign would radicalize Black communities across the free states, emboldening African Americans to embrace violence in the cause of self-defense and in the cause of mutual protection as perhaps never before in American history. Their efforts would reshape the rest of the American anti-slavery movement as well, by encouraging white abolitionists with access to a printing press, like the guy who wrote this children's anti-slavery alphabet, to try to focus the northern reading public's attention on the suffering of Black families forcibly separated by slavery, by the slave trade, and by the kidnapping of free people. But most immediately, outrage over the abduction of these 5 particular boys would force lawmakers in Pennsylvania to pass a tough new anti-kidnapping measure known as a personal liberty law. And this 1826 personal liberty law would enrage Southern slaveholders, more so than any other state law passed before the Civil War. And it would set in motion a chain of court challenges to it by pro-slavery folks, a chain of political retaliations against it by pro-slavery folks, and the passage through Congress in 1850 of the Fugitive Slave Act, a pro-slavery abomination of a law that put this country on a collision course with civil war within a decade. Cornelius Sinclair's experience as a rider on this reverse Underground Railroad was the result of the confluence of massive economic and political forces. And what happened to him and the things that he made happen next would, as I've just suggested, usher in a new chapter in the history of slavery and freedom in the United States. But that lasting legacy should not be allowed to obscure the urgent and achingly human stakes of this particular story. A 10-year-old boy and 4 other free children were dragged into slavery in 1825. They would have to fight like hell to try to escape it. Thank you very much indeed. So thanks for staying with me, folks. I think Joseph is there. I see one question in the Ask a Question tab, which I'm going to visit right now. If the rest of you have a question, I do encourage you to add a question or two to that link. How do you want to do this, Joe?
So we do have that one question, and I can ask that for you. One of our attendees, Mary Newman, has asked, how do you link this story, Stolen, to what is happening today? Which is actually a very poignant question. I'm sure that's on a lot of people's minds with the theme of your story and really kind of what's happening. It's a heavy question, but
it's a heavy question, yeah. As you've seen, though, this is a book about important things as well, and not every story from the 19th, the 20th, or the 21st story has the same basically happy ending as my book Stolen. does. So there's lots of ways to think about the contemporary resonances between this story, this true story from 1825, and the world we live in now. The first one, of course, is to see a direct connection and continuity between the world, between the United States before the Civil War and the United States now, 150, 160 years later. When Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, when the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were ratified by the states and became the law of the land, we in this country did not destroy racism. All we did was outlaw certain types of slavery. Now that's a big step, and it cost the blood and treasure of 600,000 Americans to achieve that feat. It's a major milestone in our history to destroy an economic institution as entrenched as that one. And Lincoln and the Union Army and Frederick Douglass and 1,000 other people deserve all credit for that. But as people at the time would have told you, the United States created out of the rubble of the Civil War and in the carnage of slavery's death was not a country free of deep-seated racism, not only in the states of the former Confederacy, but elsewhere too. Some of Lincoln's views about African Americans do not bear terribly favorable scrutiny by our modern standards. Lincoln was a much more complicated man than sometimes we give him credit for. So there's a direct line to be drawn from slavery times to Reconstruction with its great failures, to the Jim Crow era, to the era of intense racism and segregation that produced the response that we call the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement is born in protest and born of oppression throughout the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s that civil rights leaders are responding to, and have to fight with their voices and their tools tooth and nail for just the slightest recognition that equality in law might mean something in practice. And here we are today, leaning into, peering over the precipice of something that looks broadly similar. So we could go in a different direction. I'll just draw one other parallel here, which would be to say that slavery, which I've described in my remarks a few minutes ago as dead in the carnage of civil war, is of course only legally speaking dead. Slavery is outlawed everywhere in the United States now, and almost in every country around the world except maybe one or two. And yet slaveries of various sort continue all around us every day of our lives. Around the world today, human rights organizations reckon that about 40 million people woke up in some type of slavery this morning. That can often be agricultural slavery, that can be domestic slavery, that can be sex slavery. And this is not just a problem that happens only outside of the United States now in 2020. It's happening in the United States too. The Human Rights Campaign, Amnesty International, Free the Slaves, Polaris, other NGOs who work on this stuff say that this morning about 40,000 people woke up in the United States in agricultural slavery, in domestic slavery, or in sex slavery. So we can't and shouldn't be blind to this, that for all the progress we've made, for all the accomplishments we've made in the name of equality during and since the Civil War, the work remains unfinished, and we all get to pick a side.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you. I personally just want to say, as someone who studied history, bachelor's degree from Rhode Island College, it's extremely important to expand your mind with works such as this, because these are works that you don't often hear about when you're in your American history class. I, until tonight, have not heard of Cornelius. I have seen 12 Years a Slave, so I am aware that something like this happened, but I did not know it was that young and that prevalent, and supplied labor and property to the interior of the Deep South, which, you know, it's mind-boggling. It's sickening and mind-boggling. But
so I'm happy to comment on that briefly, Joe. If you want to put up the book slide so people can see how they can get a signed copy if they want to. Yeah, so I shared all the same premises that Joseph just laid out for us, right? When I started this research project back in 2011, I didn't know any of this stuff. I had heard of 12 Years a Slave. I don't think I'd even read it back in 2011, and the movie hadn't been made yet. If someone had caught me off guard and said, hey, do you think what happened to Solomon Northup in that book, 12 Years a Slave, happened all the time? I would have said, no, he was unlucky, the wrong guy in the wrong place. This is a one-off. But as I dug into this true story of these 5 boys, I came to realize, as I pointed out in the talk, that what happened to them and what happened to Solomon Northup was happening hundreds of times a year, maybe tens of thousands of times over the course of the early 19th century. And it's not well known because the kidnappers who did this were often remarkably effective. Very few people got to return to their old lives, got to return to their families and friends to tell their stories. That's why Northup and Cornelius and these other folks are so unusual. Most of the time, if you want to study something like this, you'll find that you can document the disappearance of a person or a small group of people quite commonly, because missing persons ads like the one I read for African Americans are all over early 19th century newspapers. But then you never hear anything else because the people are never found. They never return. They never are able to escape. Slavery is a very oppressive system designed to keep people in. And if you'll find yourself cutting sugarcane 1,000 miles from a home in Rhode Island, in New York, in Pennsylvania, then the chances of you being able to get a message out, let alone make your own way back over those sort of geographies, are infinitesimally small. So this was a voyage of discovery for me, finding one new source at a time that slowly opened up this, I guess, vista on just how common and frequent the kidnapping and trafficking into slavery of free Americans in the United States actually was. It opened my eyes, and I have trouble looking away now.
Well, Professor, we want to thank you for speaking and spending your time with us tonight and speaking on Stolen. It looks like we may have another question. This is quite another heavy one from Mary Newman. Mary, this is a fantastic question that you have. I'm not sure if this may be in the wheelhouse of what we were speaking about this evening, though. Quite the question.
So I'm just looking at it right now. Yes, I'm not going to answer every aspect of it, but if I can just take one quick thing from it, the narrow historical point, actually, Mary, so I apologize for lopping off some of your question here. It was about the Constitutional Convention, and the Constitution that we have today is a fantastic document in many ways. And I keep saying we when I talk about the United States. You might have noticed that in my remarks. I've been a naturalized US citizen since the fall of 2016. There was a presidential election, and suddenly I really wanted to vote in the next one, so I became a naturalized US citizen. So when I say we, it's with some legal standing here. But the Constitution is a lot to be proud of in the way it's changed over time and adapted to the needs of its citizenry. But we should recognize that many of its original provisions were actually quite favorable to the class of slave owners and slave holders that dominated some parts of the Constitutional Convention back in 1787. We're all familiar with the 3/5 clause and how that works to promote slave property and the interests of slaveholders. And it's one of about, a dozen or so provisions in the original Constitution, which in some shape or form, directly or indirectly, seem to prop up the institution of slavery. And I mention this just to remind folks of the incredible odds that anti-slavery activists, that runaway slaves, and every other type of activist and oppositional person had to overcome to push slavery into the dustbin of history by 1865. Those were incredible odds, and yet Americans did it. And so every time we face crushing oppression, Mary's question used the word dictatorship in the question here, it can seem so depressing and so difficult to imagine a future different from the present in which we're living. But the anti-slavery movement and the actions of enslaved people who freed themselves over decades and centuries is a remarkably courage-giving, affirming story of what Americans can accomplish when they have right on their side. So I always look to the anti-slavery fight with great optimism, enthusiasm, and encouragement, even on the dark days.
Well said. Well said, Professor. But you did mention the Constitutional Convention, which is a great segue into what we're going to have you again on June 25th. Do you want to tell our folks a little bit just about why we're having you back on the 25th?
Yeah, this is quite the segue, isn't it? So on June 25th, Joseph, the time again that day is?
6 p.m.
6 p.m. At 6 p.m. on June 25th, I'll be back on the Zoom talking with folks about Hamilton the musical and its relationship to American history. Believe it or not, I am a huge fan of Hamilton the musical, and I want folks to understand what that musical by Lin-Manuel Miranda gets right about American history, which is a lot, what it gets wrong about American history, which is some important things, and why we should care about this Broadway musical's accuracy, for lack of a better word. This is a really fun presentation. It's quite audio-visual. There's some wonderful slides I want to show you, a couple of great clips I want to play you. If you're remotely interested either in the real Alexander Hamilton or the great Broadway musical Hamilton, which will begin streaming, I think, on Disney Plus in early July, by the way, then I hope you come out and hear me talk with great enthusiasm about this musical and its relationship to American history. June 25th.
That's right, Professor. Thank you very much again for spending some time with us this evening, and we look forward to seeing you on the 25th of June. And for all of those still watching, if you have not looked at our website yet, the Redwood Library website has a list of all of our virtual lectures that you can sign up for today, and keep an eye out for the Hamilton lecture. Registration should be within the next couple of days for that. And again, on behalf of the Redwood Library, Benedict Lecca, our Executive Director, and all of our staff, thank you, Professor, and thank you for everyone joining us this evening. We will see you next week.